Hello, it's Mrs. Wallace. How you doing? I just wanted to do this quick video in case you were out on Wednesday. We had a couple people out, and I just wanted to catch up on some of the content. We spent part of the period just reviewing a couple of notes and answering some questions about Reconstruction and stuff like that. But this content that I'm going to introduce here, that I'm sharing for everybody who is out, really is a focus on the end of Reconstruction and also on the beginnings of the New South. And we'll look into this some more in class tomorrow. So this is kind of preliminary. And of course, it's like late on Thursday night, so you may not get to this until, after class tomorrow. But a few things. And there's one note that I have on the screen, which is an election of 1876. This is really the formal end of Reconstruction. We know that the North is going to, refocus its priorities. Even when Grant was president, there was a lot of scandals. There's an economic panic. There's a variety of other issues that are taking place that create disinterest, perhaps, in Reconstruction. There's this, kind of increasing levels of violence that happen in the South. Lots of people get concerned about that. So there's an interest in kind of minimizing some of that violence. And in the middle of all of that, there are some horrific massacres to squelch political power. The Colfax massacre is one of those examples. And it becomes a famous example because perpetrators are arrested. And the hope for the Northerners, the radical Republicans, was to enable the 14th Amendment to have some teeth in it. So the 14th Amendment could be, could be enforced. There was these perpetrators of the Colfax massacre could have been tried with a federal crime, basically for not enabling people to participate, in the political system. And they've essentially, kind of done something unconstitutional. And this kind of interest in prosecuting people for a federal crime is like the federal government's way of trying to address the violence in the South. So the KKK, the Enforcement Acts, all of these things are about the federal government really attempting to try to stop some of the violence. And in the Grant administration, there is a focus on trying to stop the violence, and there are arrests made. By the time of the Colfax massacre, the arrests that are made are challenged in court, and the Supreme Court ultimately decides that the federal government does not have any power to arrest, then charge individuals who might even act as a mob and might commit violence to the extent that they might, squelch somebody's political rights. That was not a federal crime because the federal government doesn't have that kind of power. According to the 14th Amendment, the courts basically say if the state of Louisiana conducted the Colfax massacre in the name of the state, then that would be a violation of the 14th Amendment. But individuals who are acting on their own regard, vigilante violence or whatever, cannot be policed by the federal government. And of course, that would be very different today. We talked in class a little bit about January 6th and how that's, kind of being prosecuted. But in any case, the time period after the Colfax massacre becomes a time, the big takeaway is that in this case known as the Cruikshank case, it's a Supreme Court case. The courts basically minimize the power of the 14th Amendment and declare the Enforcement Act unconstitutional. So the big takeaway I suggested to students in the class is oftentimes we think, well, Reconstruction, completely failed because there was all of this violence, and that's what made it, so difficult. And there is some truth in that. The violence does intimidate groups of people, and ultimately a lot of political power gets taken away because people get intimidated. The white supremacist groups, do play a role in dialing down a lot of Black political power. The other issue, however, is that the federal government does try to stop some of that racist political violence. And they do in that phase 2 of violence that was talked about in the video. So there is this like movement to try to get the the violence, completely broken up and to restrict it. Arrests are made, but it's not enough. And not only that, because the court decides that the Enforcement Act is unconstitutional, there gets sent this really big message that the federal government cannot touch basically mob violence. And it's at that point that we see an explosion of mob violence in the form of what we recognize as like unmasked vigilante groups who are all about this horrific racial violence. So Reconstruction before 1876 is starting to lose its steam. The radical Reconstruction is kind of falling apart. The last straw is in 1876. There's a presidential election, and it's a close election. Rutherford B. Hayes is the Republican candidate. Samuel Tilden is the Democratic candidate. And this is a very close election. You can see the electoral vote is 50-50, and the popular vote is for Sam Tilden. And to make it crazier, there's some contested votes. So there's a lot of unrest and upset about who the president will be. There becomes a commission, and through a whole bunch of backroom politicking, we see a little bit of a deal made. And the basic idea is that the Republicans will get the presidency. So Grant had been a Republican. Before that, Johnson, and then, Lincoln had all been Republicans. Rutherford B. Hayes will also be a Republican. But in exchange for the Republicans winning the presidency, the radical Reconstruction, will essentially close up. And the federal government will remove forces from the South and essentially let the state governments redeem their state governments to the former, white supremacist political power. Okay, so we see a move out of the federal government from the South, and that creates a lot more opportunities for state government to kind of reign in the South. This election becomes really important because it does suggest a little bit of a formal end to Reconstruction. This is President Rutherford B. Hayes, and in his inaugural address, Hayes says what the South needed most was the restoration of wise, honest, and peaceful local self-government. So this is no longer about the federal government. Federal government's picking up and taking off. This is about state government, basically, and even local government beyond that. All of the racial issues are going to be decided by southern states, so kind of have an idea of how that will go. And the federal government no longer involved. This is when many historians will date the end of Reconstruction, okay? And of course, there become other priorities for the Republican Party, the Western expansion, moving the railroad, out west and expanding manufacturing and whatnot. The last thing that we really talked about in class was historiography. And I'll introduce this briefly just so you have a sense of it. Historiography, it sounds like a disease, right? I don't want historiography. But the historiography is really what historians are very interested in. It's very discipline based. Historiography is the way in which historians write about history. And, we know that history is sometimes told from different perspectives. So you can have, different histories exist for a particular topic, right? We sometimes see historical narratives shifting a little bit over time because modern historians might look at a topic, much, in a very different way than historians years ago. And every single historical topic has a historiography, which over the course of time showcases schools of thought about how historians, like mainstream historians, felt about the particular topic. So the historiography of Reconstruction is actually really significant because it has traditionally been told in a very, very different way. The earliest, kind of history of Reconstruction we tend to see pretty early on in the 1900s. There's even some that precede this, but say by 1900s, we have a pretty good working narrative of Reconstruction. The Dunning School is named after a professor at Columbia University, and it's a school of thought about Reconstruction that we would look at with our modern eyes and see as wholeheartedly very much emphasizing racism. The Dunning School is really an description of Reconstruction as something that failed, but it didn't necessarily fail because there was political violence. The Dunning School largely blames Black Americans, corruption in Southern governments under radical Reconstruction, maybe blames the Northern federal government for some of its, pushing its mandates on the South. There becomes a very distinct type of understanding of what Reconstruction was, and the South is kind of played as a victim in this, in particular the white Southern Democrats. And, it is a very common school of thought and a very common description of Reconstruction for many years. And in class, we looked at a clip of The Birth of a Nation, which was created as a silent movie in 1915, but it's about Reconstruction. So in 1915, now decades after Reconstruction, but kind of at the heart of when historians are writing about Reconstruction, we see this American movie that includes the KKK and includes, a very victimized South being taken over by Northern federal military. And we also see a lot of very racist depictions of how Reconstruction was working in the South, and that the blame should be on Black Americans. So Birth of a Nation is horrifically racist, but it also, even though it was controversial in its day and age, the NAACP tried to get the movie shut down. It became an incredibly popular movie in American society. So this idea of what the telling of Reconstruction is all about was very commonplace knowledge for decades and decades of time. It's really been much more modern that we see kind of historians pushing back on the Dunning School. W.E.B. Du Bois is a useful name to know about. W.E.B. Du Bois is a Black American who was the first Black man to graduate from Harvard with a PhD. He ends up becoming important because he creates, with others, the NAACP, also becomes a significant writer. And one of the things that he writes is a book about Reconstruction. So in 1935, he's around for a long time in the 1900s, but in 1935, he writes this book about Reconstruction. And we looked at an excerpt of it in class. If you want the excerpt, I'll share it with you tomorrow. But it basically, accuses historians. He's kind of telling historians, that they're doing Reconstruction incorrect. What they're teaching and what they're telling Reconstruction was about, seems to be really, really off, according to W.E.B. Du Bois. And, he makes a case that the purpose of history is largely to tell the truth, that, narratives are not meant to tell a national story that people want to hear. It's to tell the truth. And, he pitches a certain argument for what history is about. By the 1940s, we have a few other historians who are suggesting radical Reconstruction, was not a vindictive type of thing on the South. The Southern states were not victims. In fact, this racist violence was very much a part of kind of the Southern Democratic worldview. And it's not really until the 1960s where we see historians start to write very, in a mainstream way, that radical Republicans may have actually been involved in a really bold experiment, and President Johnson might have actually been racist. It takes some time for that part of the narrative to actually develop. In the 1960s is a time of the civil rights movement. So think of Dr. King and Rosa Parks and some of those events like the I Have a Dream speech. All of those events create a lot of changes in America. One of those changes is to historiography. So people start looking at the role of Black Americans in political power, looking at the role of President Johnson, and picking up on some new arguments in the 1960s about what Reconstruction was all about. The last group to note, or maybe the second to last group to note, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you have Eric Foner. Eric Foner is really wrote a book in the 1990s. He takes the idea of Reconstruction further, not only saying it was a bold experiment and wow, look at what they tried, and it's a lot better than it was, but even though it wasn't perfect, by the 1990s, Foner is arguing that Reconstruction was revolutionary. This multiracial democracy that gets set up is, something that, indicates that it's possible, and, all those things. By the time period of today, because Reconstruction is still a very active area of research, we see lots and lots of focus on particular groups of people, especially African Americans, maybe African American women, African American families, looking at particular groups and how they were affected during the time of Reconstruction. Okay, so I'll stop there, but just to give you an idea, those are some things that we did. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about the New South. Okay, be well.